great thing about early Oasis was that they were relentlessly positive. These could be the best years of our lives. You and I were going to live together. It was very, I'm going to be a rock and roll star. It's about, a lot of the first record is about being in somewhere like Burnage in Manchester, which is nowhere. It's not absolutely terrible, but it's nowhere. And having these dreams and fantasies, and the fact that Oasis had become successful with those dreams and fantasies appeared at that point to be inclusive. They were a very inclusive group. They were saying, come and join us. If you don't get yours, then I don't get mine. They weren't snobbish and snooty. And that was very attractive. I was really, I was a great fan of Oasis at that point. I saw them 3 times in '94. And although they didn't galvanize a crowd, they certainly galvanized people in other ways. And I would give them a lot of credit for that. Yeah, well, I mean, tonight I'm going to be a rock and roll star. You don't really you don't need to say any more than that. I listened to it yesterday. I thought some of the production sounded a bit strange. But again, it's that big, big, bad noise there's a track called Columbia, which is just fantastic. It just goes on forever, and it's really big and noisy. And a lot of the album is very sweet. There was a good heart to Oasis, which is not something people would necessarily say. But I think that compared to Blur, which everybody does and did and will forever do, I didn't feel that Blur had a heart. And my response to music is always based first on emotions. And then, if you like, the rational part and the intellect kicks in. But if it doesn't move you, no amount of theorizing is going to make it move you, And I got Oasis. I really empathized with what they were saying at that point. And I just couldn't get a handle on Blur. They seemed too distant. And I thought, well, it was drama school. Who are they trying to be this week? And I would think that Oasis's association with the Labour Party, which has since been derided, was entirely natural, because in a way they both at that point articulated the deep need that people had to be connected, to be part of a community, which was the result of a society that had been atomized, if you like, by the Conservatives for 16 years. I think that that coming together, which had been part of the whole Stone Roses acid house thing, was transmuted, in Oasis's case, into a particular kind of rock music. And certainly in the spring of '95, when to me they were at that peak, the problems hadn't started. And we all know what the problems were. The Select cover had a Union Jack. They realized they were reclaiming what could possibly be a dodgy bit of iconography. Only the previous year, Morrissey had unfurled a Union Jack at a concert in Finsbury Park in front of an audience of skinheads and had had terrible trouble. So the Union Jack had long been associated, unfortunately, with racists, certainly in the late 70s, when the Jam were, to me, thoughtlessly using it. The place where you would most often see the Union Jack was in National Front propaganda, stickers, stuff you'd see around town. So there was this sense that the Union Jack was a thing to be ashamed of that was only associated with the far right. So a polemic to reclaim it seemed to be a very good idea. Although fraught with great problems. And certainly you start to see the Union Jack really coming into pop culture and political culture in 1996. One of the first times I really noticed it was when Noel Gallagher appeared on Top of the Pops for Don't Look Back in Anger and had a Union Jack on his guitar. And I thought it looked shit. I thought, why is he doing that? And because times are very different from when they had what they had been when the Who were doing it in 1965, and I just thought it, to be honest, I just thought it looked vulgar. I'd just seen Ray Davies wearing a Union jacket somewhere in a concert in America, and he was just awful. And I do think it's a very problematic symbol. I think it's a problematic symbol because it's always tended to be used by the English, and although it's a flag of the Union, I felt that the Northern Irish, Welsh, and Scottish were not getting their proper representation in what was being called, after all, Britpop. It wasn't Britpop, it was Ing rock. What about all the other pop music that was happening at the time that wasn't included in Britpop? There were these great, as it happened, one-off records by people like Babylon Zoo and White Town. No, what were they called? Your Woman. Yes, it was White Town. And these were done by Asian English people, but they weren't part of Britpop. And so suddenly, this thing, which even that spring had been relentlessly positive, was just being turned into the same old mush. Tabloids got involved. When the tabloids get involved with popular culture, it's always shit. It just spoils everything, as anybody knows. You know, people wanting to be in the tabloids when they're in pop groups are just fooling themselves. And it turned everything into this conflict. The media loves conflict. And so rather than about some of the things that Oasis might have been saying and some of the things that Blur might have been saying, and they both had things to say in their very different ways, it just became about this conflict, and then you had this very primitive class politics being pushed on top. You know, Oasis were these northern English-Irish thickos. Nobody in London writing about them had ever been to Burnage, had ever been to South Manchester, or had any understanding of it. And Blur, poor things, were cast as the southern poshos, which they're not entirely, to be fair to them. So it was the kind of, the council estate versus the poshos thing. And in popular culture, because there's so much bad faith and lying about class, obviously Oasis were going to win. At that point, Oasis's stock was not very high. When they lost the battle, quote unquote, to Blur's Country House with that dreadful video, Blur seemed to have won. And when the second Oasis album came out, shortly afterwards, within the next couple of months, everybody panned it. Or no, not everybody panned it. Quite a few people panned it. A lot of people backed the wrong horse at that point, which is always very funny. The other thing that happened, of course, which is why the tabloids got interested, is that the whole thing was becoming bigger and bigger. You were starting to have these rock groups, again, going into the top 10 as a matter of routine, maybe even getting to number one. Some might say it gone to number one. You'd also had other people coming on stream into prominence, like Pulp. They had that tumultuous Glastonbury appearance caused by the fact that, yet again, the Stone Roses messed it up. If you remember, they were a last-minute substitution. And I thought Pulp were great because they were part of an outsider thing that was beginning to be forgotten in this great community thing that Oasis and New Labour were starting to project. If we all want to come together, fine. But what about the people who still want to be misshapes, who still want to be different, who are worried, like so many people are still today, about going into town and getting a smack in the mouth because you look different. And that still happens a lot. And partly as a result of the intolerance that has come out of that community idea that started in the mid-90s, okay? So I like Pulp a lot because they were authentically misshapes and outcasts. And also, I like the fact that they credited all the band members equally in composition, in publishing rights. I thought that was terrific, a democracy, rather than what happens with Oasis. And then, when Noel Gallagher has to have everything, and eventually he'll let his brother do something, but his brother writes with other people, and do they get a credit? No, they don't. So it's very different. Their practice is very different from Oasis. And to me, those practices are one of the things that have let Oasis down. And they have been let down. They've let themselves down and let other people down. And obviously, you then have the terrific Common People, which is really, really razor sharp. It changes perspective. He starts off with a Greek girl saying, I want to live like common people, I want to sleep with common people like this. And then he says, well, you can't, okay? And everybody hates a tourist, and you don't know what it's like, which is a fantastic point of view to take. And also very illustrative of something that happened due to a number of other factors, of which the chief I would submit was lad culture, which had happened since the mid-90s, and the start of Pulp were before all this, but the start of the whole lock, stock and barrel syndrome, where you have vast swathes of people, particularly in the media, who have been expensively educated, who try to appear one or two class notches, maybe even several class notches, beneath who they really are. You've got a lot of posh people trying to be working class, okay? And also, because of how patronizing they are, they think that to be working class is to be thick. And, you know, I came through the punk period when the whole idea was that people who didn't have access to expensive educations, like Johnny Rotten, like, you know, Pete Shelley or Buzzcocks, could be wonderful, could be intelligent, could shine. They didn't have to be thick. They didn't have to accept their allotted class role. And so, to me, Common People is a very important song and will remain a very important, it still stands up today, in fact, even more so. And a lot of that record that they broke through with, a different class, is full of fantastic sorted freeze and whiz that's so funny and so true. And again, asks a question that is still very appropriate. What happens when you can't party anymore? This is the problem with the whole rave culture thing. Party, 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 great, 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 great. Suddenly, what happens when the E runs out? What happens when the drugs don't work? You know? What happens when you can't party anymore? What is left? A vacancy, a hollow, a vacuum. And that to me is part of the reasons why British pop culture is in the state that it's in now, because nothing has come along to replace it. And the whole idea and people's psyches and people's bodies have been exhausted by that party, by that hedonistic imperative. Because in the end, it becomes nullity. It goes nowhere. Well, what happened is that when you had the tabloid issue, when you had the marketing of sport, marketing of lad culture, it all starts to come together. That's what modern capitalism wants. It doesn't want all these messy strands. It wants everything to come together in a package. And so you have an increasing packaging of these ideas about laddism and community and polo shirts worn outside. You get people like Chris Evans, very talented man, extremely obnoxious, to me charmless, along with all the rest of the media lads. And you have people like Chris Evans, undoubted media power, pulling in all sorts of other things. You know, he used Ocean Colour Scene as the theme music for that dreadful program he had. What was it called? TFI Friday, yeah. And again, you know, he's a very clever broadcaster and he's brilliant at it, but it was pretty moronic stuff in the end. And so you have all this marketing, really, of this very reactionary culture, all coming together. And the music starts to become reactionary as well. And this is where the whole disaster comes in, because you have the sourcing, particularly in Ocean Colour Scene, and also very much of Oasis after 95, which is to me one of the reasons why they went downhill, of the sourcing of mod, okay? And we're not talking about the proper 60s mod, which I'm just old enough to remember. I was 13 in 1966. Mod. I was 13 in 1966. I was old enough to remember the first time round. And it was very positive and in some ways very futuristic. Don't forget that it was always a point of pop music to be futuristic, to envision, to make the future seem possible. And one of the most unpleasant things that happened in British popular culture was a whole mod revival in 1979, from which you have Quadrophenia, hence Phil Daniels, and also at that point with the rise of the Jam. And Paul Weller became a kind of house god to this whole conservative, in every sense of the way, I mean straight right across the board, moment in British popular culture, with the result that you had people like Ocean Colour Scene. And it just became incredibly dull. Just a bunch of stiffos, all scared to step out of line, all wearing this uniform, nothing to do with the original mods, who were peacocks, who were dandies, who might, shock horror, even have been gay. So you have, again, this false reading of history. This is my preoccupation, because I'm a historian to some extent. And I hated the way in which a very interesting, deep, dark, compressed pop moment of 1966, Yardbirds, Supremes, Four Tops, early psychedelia, Rolling Stones, Have You Seen Your Mother, Baby, dark, weird, becomes suddenly this golden, mythical, Never Never Land of the year we won the World Cup, and this dreadful refried mod